A routine vote at the United Nations can look harmless on paper, but sometimes that kind of vote reveals more about global power than a missile launch or a military briefing. That is where this story begins. Palestine wanted to join UNESCO, a cultural and educational organization that preserves historical sites and supports education. This was not a vote about tanks, missiles, borders, or nuclear weapons. It was supposed to be a quiet diplomatic matter, but 65 countries voted no. And that number matters because those 65 countries were not just voting against Palestinian membership. They were showing the world where the pro Israel diplomatic wall stood. That wall included the United States, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and other governments that had built their foreign policy around protecting Israel from international pressure. This was the old map. This was the world where Israel could act militarily in the region and then rely on Washington, Brussels, London, and other capitals to manage the diplomatic fallout. Weapons would keep flowing, UN pressure would be blocked, sanctions would be prevented, political criticism would be softened, and Israel would remain protected inside a Western diplomatic architecture that had taken decades to build. But that map is changing. Country by country, that wall is cracking. Italy has suspended defense cooperation. France has moved against Israeli military cargo flights. Spain has imposed an arms embargo. Belgium has openly called for stronger European action. Australia and New Zealand have shifted. Japan and South Korea have shifted. Denmark, Poland, Portugal, Estonia, and other states that once stood inside the pro Israel bloc have begun moving away. And inside the United States itself, 40 senators supported blocking arms sales to Israel. That is not a symbolic detail. That is a strategic warning. And if you think that is the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious because this did not happen in isolation. The Iran war accelerated a process that was already underway. The war did not create the collapse of Israel's diplomatic support, it exposed it. It turned a slow political trend into an immediate strategic problem. Once the Strait of Hormuz was pulled into the crisis, once energy prices moved, once supply chains across Europe and Asia were disrupted, the cost of unconditional support for Israel became visible to ordinary citizens. That is when foreign policy stops being abstract. That is when governments begin to feel pressure not from diplomats, but from their own populations. To understand this, you have to understand what the old pro Israel coalition was built on. It was not built only on lobbying, it was not built only on weapons contracts. It was built on history, ideology, strategic alignment, and fear. The first pillar was the memory of the Holocaust. For the generation that came out of the Second World War, the creation of Israel was understood as a moral answer to a terrible historic crime. That memory shaped Western policy for decades, especially in Europe and America. It gave Israel a unique place in Western political imagination. The second pillar was the Cold War. Israel was seen as a Western aligned state in a region where many Arab governments had relationships with the Soviet Union. In Washington's strategic mind, supporting Israel became part of containing Soviet influence. It was placed inside the same framework as NATO, military deterrence, and the American led international order. Israel was not only a regional state, it was viewed as a forward strategic asset. The third pillar came after September 11th. The so-called war on terror allowed Israel's regional conflicts to be framed as part of the same struggle that Washington claimed it was fighting. Israel was presented as being on the front line against the same enemy America faced. That argument worked for a long time. It simplified complex conflicts into a clean political message. Israel and the West on one side, terrorism and instability on the other, but pillars weaken. Holocaust memory remains important, but the generation that carried it directly is fading. The Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago. The war on terror lost credibility after Iraq, Afghanistan, failed occupations, intelligence failures, and strategic overreach. So the old argument had to be replaced by a new one. That new argument was democracy. Israel was described as a democracy surrounded by enemies. Supporting Israel became supporting democratic values. Stay with this because the next layer is where the official story begins to fall apart. The problem is that the democratic values argument becomes harder to defend when people watch what is happening in real time. Occupation, settlement expansion, military operations in Gaza and Lebanon, civilian suffering, the Iran war, and open defiance of international pressure have created a massive gap between the Israel described in official Western speeches and the Israel many people see on their screens. That gap is now too large to cover with public relations. This is why Europe's shift matters so much. Europe is not the main military sponsor of Israel. That role belongs to the United States. But Europe gives Israel legitimacy. Europe turns American support into a broader Western consensus. Without Europe, Israel's backing begins to look narrower, more American, and more politically isolated. Europe is also economically important. It is a major trade partner, a major source of tourism, and a supplier of military components and weapons systems. So when Italy suspends defense cooperation, that is not just a statement, it means the automatic machinery of military partnership is being interrupted. Cooperation that once moved quietly through institutional channels now has to be justified politically. That changes everything. France is even more important. When France restricts Israeli military cargo flights, that is not symbolic diplomacy. Airspace is physical infrastructure. Military cargo requires routes, approvals, logistics, and political permission. If those routes become restricted, Israel's military supply environment becomes more complicated. That is not a press release. That is operational pressure. Spain's arms embargo adds another piece. Belgium's call for stronger European action adds another. Ireland, Slovenia, and others pushing for sanctions show that this is not one angry government speaking alone. It is a wider shift in European politics. The language has changed. Israel is no longer being spoken about only as a protected ally. It is increasingly being discussed in the language of sanctions, embargoes, accountability, and legal consequences. Germany remains a major holdout, and that is not surprising. Germany's relationship with Israel is shaped by a unique historical burden. The United Kingdom has moved more slowly as well. But even where governments have not fully shifted, the direction is visible. The political environment is changing. The old automatic support is no longer automatic. Now we come to the United States, and this is the center of the entire structure. Israel can absorb pressure from Spain. It can work around criticism from Belgium. It can survive diplomatic anger from several European countries. But if the American foundation begins to crack, the entire strategic structure changes. The United States provides weapons, intelligence cooperation, diplomatic cover, financial support, and the veto power that shields Israel from binding action at the UN Security Council. That is why the vote by 40 American senators matters. The resolution did not pass, but that is not the key point. The key point is that 40 senators were willing to support blocking arms sales to Israel. That is a major political signal. It tells Israel that unconditional support inside Washington is no longer guaranteed forever. It tells Europe that America's own system is divided. It tells the world that the old consensus is weakening. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. Those senators are not creating this pressure. They are responding to it. American public opinion is changing by generation. Older Americans still carry the image of Israel shaped by 1948, 1967, the Cold War, and the post 9/11 era. Middle aged Americans are more mixed. Younger Americans are much more negative because they do not see Israel through old historical memory. They see Israel through Gaza, Lebanon, settlements, war footage, American weapons, and the consequences of US policy. This is how foreign policy changes in a democracy. First, the public mood shifts. Then politicians begin testing the limits. Then votes that once seemed impossible become possible. Then policy follows, slowly at first, then suddenly. The Iran war accelerated this entire process because it turned support for Israel from a moral argument into a cost of living issue. When the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, energy markets move. Europe feels it. Asia feels it. Shipping companies feel it. Industries feel it. Ordinary citizens feel it at the pump, in electricity bills, in food prices, and in inflation. That is when a war in the Middle East becomes domestic politics in Europe. For years, European governments could manage criticism of Israel through careful language. They could say they were concerned, they could call for restraint, they could support humanitarian aid while keeping the old relationship intact. But fuel prices, supply disruptions, and industrial pressure are different. When citizens believe they are paying the price for a war they did not choose, political leaders must respond. That is what the Iran war changed. It made the cost visible. It forced European governments to ask whether unconditional alignment with Israel served their own national interests. And once that question enters the political system, it does not disappear. Israel's planners understood some of this. They are not naive. For years, they saw that Western support was weakening. They saw the generational shift. They saw Europe becoming more critical. They saw each military operation producing more international backlash than the last. So they prepared. The first part of that preparation was normalization with Arab states. The Abraham Accords were designed to reduce Israel's regional isolation and create new diplomatic facts. If Israel could normalize with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and potentially others, it could argue that the region was moving on, that Palestinian issues no longer defined Arab diplomacy, and that Israel had new partners outside the old Western framework. The second part was domestic weapons production. Israel built a powerful defense industry, air defense systems, drones, armored vehicles, electronics, surveillance platforms, missiles, and battlefield technology. This was meant to reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. If France or Spain became unreliable, Israel could say it had its own systems and its own industrial base. The third part was the search for other friends. If liberal democracies became more critical, Israel would build relationships with nationalist governments and non-Western powers that admired hardline security policies. Hungary, Brazil under Bolsonaro, India, and other states became important in this strategy. The idea was simple. If the old liberal Western coalition weakens, replace it with a new group of governments less concerned with human rights language and more focused on security, nationalism, and strategic deals. The fourth part was domestic political hardening. Israeli politics moved further right. The settler movement gained power. Hardline parties became more influential. Defying international pressure became politically useful at home. A generation ago, ignoring direct American pressure would have been dangerous for an Israeli leader. Today, for certain political audiences, defiance looks like strength, but the plan has limits, and those limits are now becoming visible. Normalization agreements are signed by governments, not by populations. Arab publics remain deeply hostile to what they see happening in Gaza, Lebanon, and the broader region. That creates pressure under the surface. A government can sign an agreement, but it still has to manage its own people, its opposition, its religious institutions, and its regional legitimacy. Domestic weapons production is real, but it is not unlimited. High intensity warfare consumes ammunition, interceptors, precision weapons, spare parts, and electronic components at a speed that even advanced industries struggle to sustain. Israel can produce many systems, but it cannot produce strategic depth by itself. It cannot replace every foreign component overnight. It cannot fight endless campaigns without supply chains. The other friend strategy is unstable because governments change, leaders lose elections, political coalitions collapse. A relationship built around one leader can disappear when that leader leaves power. India has its own interests. It has relations with Iran, Russia, and the global south. It will not simply sacrifice all of that for Israel's agenda. Serious states do not behave that way. By the end, you will understand why this is not just about Israel, Iran, or Europe. This is about credibility, deterrence, and the failure of strategic judgment in Washington. The United States has tied itself so closely to Israel that every Israeli escalation becomes an American strategic liability. If Israel expands a conflict, Washington must either defend it, restrain it, or pretend it cannot see what is happening. None of those options are good. If Washington defends Israel unconditionally, it absorbs the international backlash. If Washington tries to restrain Israel, it faces domestic political pressure. If Washington stays silent, it looks weak and dishonest. That is a strategic trap. The generational shift makes the trap worse. The Israel that older Americans remember is not the Israel younger Americans see. Older voters remember a state fighting for survival. Younger voters see a heavily armed state backed by the United States using advanced weapons in devastating military campaigns. Those are two different political images, and the generation shaped by the older image is shrinking. That does not mean U.S. policy changes overnight. Institutions have inertia, donors have power, defense contractors have interests, lobby networks exist, bureaucracies resist change. But the trend line is clear. The 40 senators are not the end. They are the beginning of a new phase. Now imagine what happens if this continues. European criticism becomes sanctions. Suspended defense agreements become permanent cancellations. Airspace restrictions become broader military transit limits. Arms embargoes spread. Public opinion hardens. More American politicians calculate that unconditional support is now a political risk. That is when the old diplomatic architecture begins to fail, not just symbolically, but operationally. Israel prepared for declining support. It did not fully prepare for active opposition from countries that used to protect it. There is a difference between losing enthusiasm and losing access. There is a difference between criticism and embargo. There is a difference between diplomatic discomfort and legal action. That difference is now becoming real. The Iran war accelerated all of this. It exposed the vulnerability of global energy. It showed how quickly a regional war can become a global economic problem. It forced Europe to ask hard questions. It forced Washington to confront the fact that Middle East policy built on old assumptions no longer fits the world that exists now. The old assumption was that American military power could control outcomes, that sanctions could force surrender, that airstrikes could restore deterrence, that Iran could be isolated, that Israel could act freely while Washington managed the diplomatic consequences. That assumption is collapsing. Iran is not isolated the way Washington wants to believe. Russia and China are not passive spectators. The global south is not following Western instructions the way it did in the 1990s. Europe is discovering that blind alignment has real economic costs. This is where bad analysis becomes dangerous. If policymakers keep using an old map, they will make decisions for a world that no longer exists. If intelligence agencies tell political leaders what they want to hear instead of what battlefield and diplomatic reality show, escalation becomes more likely. If media narratives continue pretending that every crisis can be solved with more weapons, more sanctions, and more pressure, then the public will be prepared for confrontation, but not for consequences. And consequences are what serious analysis must focus on, not slogans, not emotional speeches, not fantasy maps. Consequences. If Hormuz becomes unstable, global energy suffers. If Europe restricts military cooperation, Israel's operational flexibility shrinks. If American public opinion keeps shifting, congressional support becomes less automatic. If Iran concludes that deterrence requires stronger responses, escalation becomes harder to control. If Washington misreads all of this, it can walk into a regional war it cannot contain. The final warning is simple. The danger is not only that Israel's diplomatic support is weakening, the danger is that Washington may not understand what that weakening means until it is too late. A coalition built over decades is now eroding country by country, vote by vote, generation by generation. The Iran war did not create the erosion, but it accelerated it. And once credibility begins to crack, propaganda cannot repair it. Military escalation does not forgive bad assumptions. Missile systems do not care about political speeches. Supply chains do not respond to talking points. Energy markets do not wait for leaders to admit mistakes. And adversaries do not remain passive just because Washington insists the old order still exists. The serious question now is not whether the pro Israel coalition is under pressure. It clearly is. The serious question is whether the United States recognizes the strategic reality before it makes another reckless decision based on a collapsing narrative. Because when propaganda replaces intelligence, when loyalty replaces strategy, and when escalation replaces judgment, nations do not just lose arguments, they lose credibility, influence, control, and sometimes they lose wars they thought they were too powerful to lose.